For 5 years, Clara Whitfield walked to the same weathered fence post at the edge of town, clutching letters from a soldier who promised her forever, then vanished into silence. The whole town of Copper Creek whispered about the waiting woman, the Boston schoolteacher who refused to stop believing. But what Clara didn't know, what no one had the courage to tell her, was that the man she waited for had been dead for 4 years, and the stranger who finally brought her the truth, he was about to change everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the courage it takes to stop waiting and start living. If you want to follow Clara's journey to the very end, hit that like button and comment which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The Wyoming wind had a way of cutting through everything: wool coats, leather gloves, even hope. But Clara Whitfield had learned to stand against it, the same way she'd learned to stand against the whispers, the pitying glances, the gentle suggestions that perhaps it was time to move on. She pressed her palm against the weathered fence post, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. 5 years of touching this same spot had worn it smooth in places, polished by her persistence. The post itself was nothing remarkable, just a marker where the main road curved away from town and stretched toward the distant mountains. But to Clara, it was a vigil, a promise, a place where she could watch the horizon and believe that somewhere beyond it, Thomas Callahan was still alive, still thinking of her, still making his way back. The letters in her pocket were soft from handling, the paper threatening to tear along the creases where she'd folded and unfolded them hundreds of times. 3 letters. That was all she had. 3 letters written in Thomas's careful hand during the first months after he'd headed west to stake his claim. He'd written about the land he'd found, the cabin he was building, the life they would share. He'd written about missing her, about counting the days until she could join him. And then nothing. Clara had written back, of course, letter after letter, week after week, then month after month. She'd written until her hand cramped and her words ran dry. She'd written until the postmaster stopped meeting her eyes when she handed over another envelope. She'd written until writing felt less like communication and more like prayer, words sent into the void, hoping something out there was listening. Miss Whitfield? Clara turned at the sound of her name, quickly tucking the letters back into her coat pocket. A woman stood a few feet away. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, a wicker basket over her arm, and concern etched into the lines around her mouth. "I thought I saw you walking this way," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying that particular tone Clara had come to recognize. Gentle, careful, the way people spoke to those they considered fragile. "It's getting cold. The sun will be down within the hour." "I know." Clara managed a smile that felt thin even to her. "I was just taking some air." Mrs. Henderson's gaze drifted to the fence post, then back to Clara's face. Whatever she was thinking, she was kind enough not to say it. "Well, don't stay out too long. I've heard there's a cattle drive coming through tomorrow. The roads will be thick with dust and men." "Thank you for letting me know." Mrs. Henderson lingered for a moment longer, clearly wanting to say more. But in the end, she simply nodded and continued on her way, her skirt swishing against the dried grass as she walked. Clara watched her go, then turned back to the horizon. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for her current mood. Somewhere out there, beyond those mountains, was the land Thomas had claimed, the cabin he'd built, the life he'd promised her. Or maybe there was nothing at all. Maybe the silence wasn't delay. Maybe it was an answer she'd been refusing to hear. Clara pushed the thought away, the same way she'd been pushing it away for 5 years. Thomas had asked her to wait. He'd asked her to believe. And Clara Whitfield was nothing if not faithful to her word. She touched the fence post one final time, then turned and walked back toward town. Copper Creek, Wyoming wasn't much to look at. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a handful of houses scattered around like seeds thrown by a careless hand. It had sprung up around a copper mine that had produced just enough ore to justify its existence, then settled into the quiet rhythm of a frontier town that had learned not to expect too much from life. Clara had arrived 5 years ago with a trunk full of books, a head full of dreams, and a heart full of love for a man she'd known for exactly 3 months. Thomas Callahan had swept through Boston like a summer storm, handsome, confident, full of stories about the West and the opportunities waiting there for anyone brave enough to seize them. He'd courted Clara with wildflowers picked from public parks and promises that sparkled brighter than diamonds. When he'd left to stake his claim, Claire had promised to follow as soon as he sent word. She'd packed her bags. She'd said goodbye to her family. She'd boarded a train west and arrived in Copper Creek expecting to find Thomas waiting for her at the station. Instead, she'd found an empty platform in a town that had never heard of Thomas Callahan. The sensible thing would have been to go home. Her parents had begged her to return, had sent money for the journey back, had written increasingly desperate letters imploring her to accept that Thomas had abandoned her. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, that Thomas hadn't left her, but had been prevented from reaching her somehow. So she'd stayed. She'd taken a position as the town's school teacher, renting a small room above the general store. She'd made herself useful, made herself part of the community, and every evening, weather permitting, she walked to that fence post and watched the road, waiting for the man who had promised to give her the world. The whispers had started almost immediately. Poor Miss Whitfield. Such a shame. So young and pretty, wasting her life on a man who clearly didn't want to be found. Clara had learned to ignore them, to meet the pitying glances with a steady gaze and a polite smile. She knew what they thought of her. She knew they considered her foolish, deluded, perhaps even touched in the head. But she also knew that hope was the only thing keeping her alive. Without it, what was she? Just another woman who had been used and discarded, her dreams crumpled up like waste paper. Clara refused to be that woman. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however small, that Thomas might return. The schoolhouse was quiet when Clara arrived the next morning, the students not due for another hour. She liked this time of day, when the building belonged to her alone, and she could prepare her lessons in peace. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the rows of wooden desks and the slate board she'd covered with arithmetic problems. Clara set her books on her desk and began laying out supplies, chalk, slates, the worn primers she'd brought from Boston. The children of Copper Creek ranged from barely literate to surprisingly well-read, depending on their family's circumstances. Clara had learned to adapt, to teach multiple levels simultaneously, to celebrate small victories and push through frequent setbacks. She was straightening the American flag that hung limply in the corner when she heard the rumble. At first she thought it was thunder, a storm rolling in from the mountains. But the sound grew louder, accompanied by a cloud of dust visible through the window, and Clara realized what it was. The cattle drive. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it, but Clara hadn't expected it so early. She moved to the window and watched as the first wave of cattle appeared, a river of brown and white bodies flowing around the edges of town. Cowboys rode alongside them, their horses dancing and weaving to keep the herd in line. The sound was immense, hooves pounding, cattle lowing, men shouting commands that were lost in the general chaos. Clara had seen cattle drives before, of course. They came through Copper Creek several times a year, bringing money and news from the wider world. The cowboys would spend a night or two in town, drinking at the saloon and restocking their supplies, before moving on toward the railhead. It was exciting in its way, a reminder that Copper Creek was connected to something larger, something moving and alive. But today, Clara found herself watching with different eyes. She noticed the exhaustion on the cowboys' faces, the dust that coated everything, the relentless forward motion of the herd. These men had been traveling for weeks, maybe months, sleeping under the stars and eating whatever they could manage. They were chasing something too, money, perhaps, or adventure, or simply the next horizon. Were they any different from her, really? They waited for the end of the drive the way she waited for Thomas. They endured discomfort and uncertainty, sustained by the promise of something better ahead. Maybe everyone was waiting for something. Clara turned away from the window and went back to preparing her lessons. The cattle drive was someone else's story. Hers was still unfolding, page by unseen page, and she wasn't ready to stop believing in a happy ending. The students arrived in their usual scattered fashion, farm children who'd already done hours of chores, town children who'd lingered over breakfast, one or two who clearly wished they were anywhere else. Clara greeted each of them by name, checked their hands for cleanliness, and directed them to their seats. "Good morning, class," she said when everyone was settled. "Before we begin, I'm sure you've all noticed the cattle drive outside. I expect you'll have questions, and I expect you'll want to watch out the windows. But we have lessons to complete, so let's make a bargain. If everyone works diligently this morning, we'll take an extra long lunch break, and you can watch the Cowboys from the schoolyard. Does that sound fair?" A chorus of agreement rippled through the room, and Clara smiled. Teaching had become more than just a job over the past 5 years. It had become a lifeline. The children gave her purpose, gave her a reason to get up each morning and face a world that often felt indifferent to her existence. They didn't know about Thomas, or if they did, they were too young to understand or care. To them, Miss Whitfield was simply their teacher, a steady presence in a changing world. The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of lessons and recitations. Clara led the younger students through their letters while the older ones worked on composition. She solved disputes over pencils, praised good handwriting, and gently corrected those who hadn't done their homework. It was ordinary work, routine work, but there was satisfaction in it, the knowledge that she was building something, however small. When the lunch bell rang, the children erupted from their seats and streamed toward the door, eager to see the Cowboys up close. Clara followed more slowly, stopping on the schoolhouse steps to watch her students cluster along the fence that bordered the schoolyard. The herd had mostly passed by now, leaving behind a settling cloud of dust and a few stragglers being pushed along by tired riders. But the chuck wagon had stopped near the edge of town, and some of the Cowboys had dismounted to stretch their legs and water their horses. The children watched with wide eyes, pointing and whispering among themselves. "Miss Whitfield?" Clara turned to find Jimmy Parker, one of her older students, standing beside her. He was a serious boy, 12 years old and already bearing the weight of helping his widowed mother run their small farm. "Yes, Jimmy?" "My ma wanted me to ask, do you know if the cattle drive is staying overnight? She's thinking of selling some pies to the Cowboys, but only if they'll be here long enough." "I'm not certain," Clara admitted. "You might ask one of the men yourself." Jimmy nodded but hesitated. "Would you come with me? My ma says I shouldn't talk to strange men alone." Clara smiled at that. Wise advice in a frontier town. "Of course. Let's go together." They walked toward the chuck wagon, Clara keeping one eye on her other students. The Cowboys were gathered in small groups, some eating, some checking their gear. They looked rough but not threatening, working men doing a hard job. As they approached, one of the Cowboys looked up. He was younger than most, barely out of his teens, with a sunburned face and a gap-toothed smile. "Help you, ma'am?" "We were wondering if the drive will be staying in town tonight," Clara said. "Some of the local women might have goods to sell." "One night, ma'am. We'll be moving on come sunrise." He touched the brim of his hat politely. "Appreciate you asking, though, and if someone's got pies, I'll be first in line." Jimmy grinned at that, his shyness forgotten. "My ma makes the best apple pie in the territory. I'll tell her to save one for you." "You do that, young man." Clara was about to turn away when she noticed another man watching them from a distance. He stood apart from the others, holding the reins of a dark horse and studying Clara with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. She met his gaze and held it, refusing to be the first to yield. He wasn't young, somewhere in his 30s, she guessed, and he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. His face was all angles and planes, softened only by eyes that were surprisingly gentle. He wore the same dusty clothes as the other Cowboys, but something about the way he carried himself suggested he was more than just another hired hand. After a long moment, he inclined his head in a gesture that was almost a bow. Then he turned away, swinging up onto his horse and riding toward the back of the herd. "Who was that?" Jimmy asked. "I don't know," Clara said. But she found herself watching until horse and rider disappeared into the dust, an odd flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite name. That evening, Clara walked to the fence post as usual. The cattle drive had brought extra activity to town. The saloon was loud, the general store was busy, and there was an energy in the air that felt almost festive. But Clara's ritual remained unchanged. She stood at the fence, watching the road, waiting. The sun was just beginning to set when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the light tread of Mrs. Henderson or any of the other women who sometimes came to check on her, but heavier steps, a man's boots on the hard-packed earth. Clara turned, already preparing her polite dismissal. Cowboys sometimes approached her at the fence, having heard about the waiting woman and wanting to see her for themselves. Usually a cool look and a few firm words sent them on their way, But the man who stood before her now wasn't trying to satisfy idle curiosity. It was the man from the cattle drive, the one who'd watched her with those gentle, knowing eyes. "Miss?" he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sir." Clara kept her voice neutral. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her at the fence post, then at the road stretching into the distance, then back at her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like he wasn't used to making conversation. "I've been watching you. I'm aware." Clara's tone sharpened. "If you're hoping for entertainment, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. I'm simply taking some air. That's not what the folks in town say." He shifted his weight, leather creaking. "They say you've been coming to this spot for 5 years. They say you're waiting for a man who isn't coming back." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "What people say is their own business. It doesn't concern me." "Maybe not." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "But I've known some waiting in my time, miss. Done some myself. And there's a line between holding on to hope and letting it hold on to you, between waiting and hiding." The words hit harder than Clara expected. She drew a sharp breath, anger and something else, something that felt dangerously like recognition, warring in her chest. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "You don't know why I'm here or what I'm waiting for. So I'll thank you to keep your opinions to yourself." The man held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Fair enough. I've said my piece." He touched his hat again. "Name's Luke Hart. I'm the scout for this drive. We're moving on in the morning, so you won't have to suffer my opinions much longer." He turned to go, and Clara should have let him. Should have been glad to see the back of him, this stranger who'd presumed to understand her life in the space of 5 minutes. But something made her call out. "Wait." Luke Hart stopped, looking back over his shoulder. "What did you mean," Clara asked, "about the line between waiting and hiding?" He was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the fading light. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Sometimes we tell ourselves we're being faithful, patient, strong, but really, we're just scared. Scared of what we'll have to face if we stop waiting, if we let ourselves know what we already know." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not saying that's you, miss. I'm just saying it's worth asking the question." He walked away then, his long strides carrying him back toward town before Clara could think of a response. She stood frozen at the fence post, his words echoing in her head. Scared of what we'll have to face if we stop waiting, if we let ourselves know what we already know. The letters in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. 3 letters, 5 years of silence, and a question she'd been refusing to ask. What if Thomas wasn't coming back? What if she was waiting for a ghost? Clara pressed her hand against the fence post, feeling the familiar grain of the wood. But for the first time, the touch didn't bring comfort. It felt like holding onto a rope that was fraying, thread by thread, each day bringing her closer to the moment when it would snap and she would finally have to let go. She stood there until the stars came out, until the night grew cold enough to seep through her coat. Then she turned and walked back to town, feeling like something had shifted inside her, a door opening onto a room she wasn't sure she was ready to enter. Clara didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the general store, listening to the distant sounds of the saloon and thinking about Luke Hart's words. She thought about the 5 years she'd spent in this town, the thousands of hours she'd stood at that fence post. She thought about all the letters she'd written that had never been answered. And she thought about Thomas. It was strange. She realized she had trouble picturing his face anymore. The memory had faded like an old photograph, the details growing soft and indistinct. She remembered his voice, or thought she did. She remembered the way he'd laughed, the stories he'd told, the promises he'd made. But the actual image of him, the color of his eyes, the shape of his jaw, the way he'd looked when he said he loved her, had become blurred, replaced by an idea of Thomas that might be nothing like the man himself. When had that happened? When had she stopped remembering a person and started remembering a dream? Clara turned onto her side, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow the cattle drive would leave, and Luke Hart with it. She would probably never see him again. His words would fade, the way Thomas's face had faded, and she would go back to her routine of teaching and waiting. But even as she told herself that, She knew something had changed. A seed had been planted, a question that wouldn't stop growing no matter how much she tried to ignore it. What if she was hiding instead of waiting? What if she already knew the truth she was afraid to face? Seb. The next morning was chaos. Clara was on her way to the schoolhouse when she heard the shouting. A crowd had gathered near the edge of town, voices raised in alarm. She quickened her pace, pushing through the onlookers until she could see what was happening. A young boy, thin, dirty, clothes too big for his small frame, was being held by one of the cowboys. The boy was struggling, trying to twist free, but the cowboy held him firmly by the collar. Found him hiding in the chuck wagon, the cowboy was saying. Must have snuck in somewhere back in Colorado. Been stealing food from the supplies. Let me go, the boy shouted, his voice high and desperate. I wasn't hurting anything. He broke off, his struggles weakening. Clara saw tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face, and something in her chest twisted. She pushed forward, ignoring the surprised looks of the people around her. What's going on here? What are you doing to that child? The cowboy looked at her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. This ain't none of your concern, ma'am, just dealing with a stowaway. He's a child. Clara's voice was firm. Whatever he's done, manhandling him in the street isn't the answer. With respect, ma'am. Let him go. The voice came from behind Clara, low and commanding. She turned to find Luke Hart approaching, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Luke, this boy's been stealing from us. I said let him go. Luke's tone left no room for argument. The cowboy released his grip, and the boy stumbled, nearly falling before Clara caught his arm. Easy, she murmured. You're all right now. The boy looked up at her with eyes that were far too old for his face, eyes that had seen things no child should see. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, but there was a wariness in his expression that spoke of a lifetime of hard lessons learned. What's your name? Clara asked gently. For a long moment, the boy didn't answer. Then barely above a whisper, Noah. Noah Briggs. Noah. Clara smiled, keeping her voice soft. That's a good name. A strong name. Luke stepped closer, crouching down so he was at eye level with the boy. Noah, where's your family? Where are your folks? Noah's jaw tightened, and Clara saw him struggle to maintain his composure. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, the way people sounded when they were trying very hard not to feel anything at all. Ma's dead. Fever took her back in Colorado. Pa left before I was born. There's nobody else. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Clara felt her heart crack along lines she hadn't known existed. How long have you been on your own? Luke asked. Since the spring. Noah's chin lifted slightly, a spark of defiance breaking through the numbness. I don't need help. I can take care of myself. I can see that, Luke said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet respect. You've done well to make it this far, but the drive's moving on today, and where we're headed isn't a place for a boy alone. Noah's composure finally cracked. But I don't have anywhere else to go. What am I supposed to do? Clara heard herself speak before she'd consciously decided to. You could stay here. Both Luke and Noah turned to look at her. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but she didn't back down. Copper Creek has families who might take him in, she continued. There's a foster system of sorts, informal, but it works. I know people who have children his age, good people, who would give him a home. You'd do that? Noah's voice was barely a whisper. You'd find me a place? Clara thought about her own waiting, her own loneliness, the years she'd spent hoping for something that might never come. Here was a child with no one to hope for him, no one to stand by a fence post watching for his return. Here was a chance to give what she herself had been so desperately seeking. Yes, she said. I would. She looked up at Luke and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something like wonder, something like recognition, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. All right then, Luke said softly. He turned to the cowboy who'd been holding Noah. Send word to the drive boss. We'll delay departure for a few hours while we get the boy settled. But Luke, a few hours, Luke repeated. We can spare that much. The cowboy grumbled, but moved off to deliver the message. The crowd began to disperse, sensing that the excitement was over. Clara was left standing with Luke and Noah, the morning sun warming her face, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. She had no idea what she was doing. She had her own problems, her own burdens, her own unanswered questions. What right did she have to take responsibility for a child when she could barely take responsibility for herself? But when Noah's small hand slipped into hers, holding on tight like she was the first solid thing he'd found in months of drifting, Clara knew it didn't matter. Some things were more important than having the right. The Miller family lived on a small farm at the edge of town, a modest but well-kept property with a whitewashed house and a red barn that tilted slightly to the east. Samuel Miller was a blacksmith who did most of his work in town. His wife Elizabeth ran the farm with the help of their 3 children. Clara had taught all 3 Miller children at various times over the past 5 years. She knew Elizabeth as a steady, practical woman with a warm heart and an endless supply of patience. If anyone in Copper Creek could give Noah what he needed, it was the Millers. Still, Clara felt nervous as she approached the farmhouse with Noah's hand still clasped in hers. Luke had offered to come along, but Clara had insisted on handling this herself. She didn't want Noah to feel like he was being handed off, passed from stranger to stranger, with no say in his own fate. "This is the place?" Noah asked, looking at the house with wary eyes. "This is it." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "The Millers are good people, Noah. They have children your age and plenty of room. But I want you to know something." She crouched down, meeting his gaze directly. "This isn't permanent unless you want it to be. We're just going to talk to them, see if it might be a good fit. And if it's not, we'll figure something else out, together, okay?" Noah studied her face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. "Okay?" They walked up to the house together, and Clara knocked on the door. A moment later, Elizabeth Miller appeared, her hands dusted with flour and her face showing surprise at finding the schoolteacher on her doorstep. "Miss Whitfield, what brings you all the way out here?" "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. I'm sorry to intrude, but I have something important to discuss with you." Clara put her hand on Noah's shoulder. "This is Noah Briggs. He needs a home." Elizabeth's gaze dropped to Noah, and Clara watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. The quick assessment of his threadbare clothes, his too thin frame, the bruised look of a child who'd been fending for himself. To her credit, Elizabeth didn't ask questions. She simply opened the door wider. "Come in, both of you. I've just made biscuits." The kitchen was warm and smelled of baking bread. Elizabeth settled Clara and Noah at the scrubbed wooden table and placed a plate of fresh biscuits between them, along with a pot of honey. Noah stared at the food like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Go ahead," Elizabeth said gently. "You look like you could use a good meal." Noah glanced at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. He reached out slowly, took a biscuit, and bit into it. His eyes widened, and for just a moment he looked like what he was, a little boy experiencing something wonderful. Clara explained the situation while Noah ate, how he'd been found with the cattle drive, how he'd lost his mother and had no one else, how the drive couldn't take him where it was going. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Clara finished, Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Noah with eyes that were soft but assessing. "Noah, how old are you?" "8, ma'am." He'd finished 3 biscuits and was eyeing a 4th, but seemed hesitant to take it. "Have another," Elizabeth said, pushing the plate toward him. "I've got more in the oven." As Noah reached for the biscuit, she continued, "What do you like to do?" "When you're not traveling with cattle drives, I mean." Noah considered this. "I like animals, ma'am. Back when Ma was alive, we had a goat named Pepper. I took care of her. We've got a milk cow named Daisy who could use some extra attention, and chickens that need feeding every morning." Elizabeth smiled. "Think you could handle that?" For the first time since Clara had met him, Noah's expression shifted toward something like hope. "Yes, ma'am. I could handle that." Elizabeth looked at Clara, and something passed between them, woman to woman, an understanding that didn't need words. "Let me talk to Samuel when he gets home tonight, but I think we can make this work." Clara felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to release. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I can't tell you how much—" "Elizabeth," the older woman's voice was firm but kind. "And you don't need to thank me. This is what neighbors do." She reached out and touched Noah's head lightly, the gesture natural and maternal. Besides, I've always thought our house could use another child running around. 3 isn't nearly enough chaos. Noah looked up at her with wonder in his eyes. You mean I could really stay? For real? For real. Elizabeth's smile was warm. If you want to. I want to. The words came out in a rush. I want to stay. Clara blinked back unexpected tears. This was right. This was exactly right. This was the kind of ending she'd been hoping for. Not for herself, but for this brave little boy who'd survived so much alone. She stood to leave, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly the beginning of something precious. But at the door, she turned back. Noah, I'll come visit soon, and when you're ready, there's a place at my school for you. Would you like that? Noah nodded eagerly. Yes, Miss Whitfield, I'd like that very much. Clara smiled, feeling something shift inside her, something that had nothing to do with Thomas or fence posts or waiting. She had helped someone today, really helped them, and it felt like the first truly good thing she'd done in years. Luke was waiting for her outside the schoolhouse when she returned to town. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, hat tipped back on his head, looking for all the world like a man who had nowhere else to be. The boy settled? He asked. The Millers are going to take him in. Clara couldn't keep the warmth out of her voice. He'll have a real home, a real family. Good. Luke pushed away from the wall, falling into step beside her as she walked. That was well done, what you did for him. Not everyone would have stepped up like that. It was the right thing to do. Most people know what the right thing is. Not many actually do it. Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the cattle drive preparation filtering through from the far end of town. We're leaving within the hour, Luke said finally. I wanted to say goodbye. Clara felt a strange pang at the words. Stranger still because she barely knew this man. I hope the rest of your drive goes well. It will. We're good at what we do. He paused, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Miss Whitfield, Clara, can I ask you something? She nodded, not trusting her voice. The man you're waiting for, do you love him, still? The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to say yes, of course, that's why she waited, but the words stuck in her throat. Did she love Thomas? She'd loved the idea of him, certainly, loved the future he'd promised. But the man himself, the real Thomas Callahan. I don't know, she heard herself say. I'm not sure I ever really knew him well enough to love him, not the way you should love someone you're planning to spend your life with. The admission felt like a betrayal, but it also felt like truth. Luke nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then maybe it's not him you're waiting for. Maybe it's something else. Like what? Permission. His eyes met hers, steady and calm. Permission to stop, to move forward, to admit that you want something different than what you've been holding on to. Clara's breath caught, because he was right. He was absolutely right, and she hated him a little for seeing it so clearly. You don't know me, she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. No. Luke reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, plain, unsealed, her name written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. But I know something that might matter to you. He pressed the envelope into her hands. Don't open it here, he said. Wait until I'm gone. Wait until you're alone and you have time to read it properly. His voice softened. And Clara, whatever it says, I want you to know. I've seen a lot of people stuck in the past. You're not one of them. You're stronger than you think. Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat in that way he had, turned, and walked away. Clara stood frozen, the envelope burning in her hands, watching until he disappeared around a corner. She looked down at the envelope. Her name, written in dark ink. No return address, no indication of what waited inside. The cattle drive left an hour later. Clara didn't go to watch. She sat in her room above the general store, the envelope on the table before her, trying to find the courage to open it. She thought about Luke's words, about permission, about being stuck in the past. She thought about Noah, finding a new home after losing everything, starting over, moving forward. And finally, As the sun began to set and the sounds of the cattle drive faded into memory, Clara reached for the envelope. Her hands were shaking, but she opened it anyway. The words on the page blurred and sharpened again, as Clara read them a second time, then a third. The letter was short, barely half a page, but each sentence landed like a blow, driving the air from her lungs until she couldn't remember how to breathe. Miss Whitfield, I debated whether to give you this information. It is not my place to interfere in the life of a stranger. But I have watched you stand at that fence post, and I have heard what the people of this town say about you, and I cannot in good conscience ride away without telling you what I know. 3 years ago, I was part of a crew working the silver mines near Leadville, Colorado. A man named Thomas Callahan was among us. He spoke often of a woman back east, a school teacher he planned to send for once he'd made enough money to build a proper home. He carried her letters in his pocket and read them by firelight when he thought no one was watching. In the spring of 1874, there was an accident in the mine. A support beam collapsed. Thomas Callahan was killed instantly, along with 4 other men. They are buried in the cemetery outside Leadville, in unmarked graves because there was no one to pay for headstones. I am sorry to be the one to tell you this. I am sorry that no one told you sooner. But you deserve to know the truth, Miss Whitfield. You deserve to stop waiting for a man who cannot return to you, not because he chose to leave, but because he was taken. Whatever you do with this information is your choice. But please know that Thomas Callahan did not abandon you. He spoke of you until the very end. He loved you as much as any man can love a woman he was trying to reach. With respect, Luke Hart. Clara's hands trembled so violently that the paper shook, the words dancing before her eyes. She set the letter down on the table and pressed her palms flat against the worn wood, trying to anchor herself to something solid, something real. Thomas was dead. Thomas had been dead for 3 years. All this time, all the letters she'd written, all the hours she'd spent at the fence post, all the hope she'd clung to like a drowning woman clutching driftwood, he had been lying in an unmarked grave in Colorado, unable to hear her, unable to answer, unable to return. A sound escaped her throat, something between a laugh and a sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth, muffling it, though there was no one to hear. Her room was small and bare, furnished with only the essentials. A bed, a washstand, the table where the letter now lay like a wound torn open. She had known. Some part of her had always known. The silence had been too complete, too absolute for anything other than death. A man who had loved her the way Thomas claimed to. A man who had asked her to wait, to believe, to follow him west, would have found a way to write, would have sent word, would have done something, anything, to let her know he was alive. But she hadn't let herself believe it. She had wrapped herself in hope like a burial shroud, hiding inside it, using it as a shield against the unbearable possibility that she was alone, that she had always been alone, that the future she'd been waiting for had died in a Colorado mine shaft 3 years ago, and she had been mourning a ghost without even knowing it. Clara stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her chest felt tight, her skin too small, her thoughts careening in every direction at once. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to move, to do something, to escape the suffocating weight of the truth pressing down on her. She grabbed her shawl and fled the room, taking the stairs 2 at a time, bursting through the back door of the general store into the alley behind. The night air hit her face like cold water, sharp and bracing, and she gulped it in great lungfuls as she walked, away from the store, away from the main street, away from everything familiar. Her feet carried her without conscious direction, and she wasn't surprised when she found herself at the fence post. Of course. Where else would she go? This was where she had spent 5 years of her life, waiting for something that would never come. This weathered piece of wood had become more real to her than the man she'd been waiting for. Clara pressed her hand against the post, feeling the grain smooth beneath her palm. How many times had she stood here? How many sunsets had she watched from this spot, scanning the horizon for a figure that would never appear? How many prayers had she whispered into the wind, begging for a sign, a word, anything to tell her that her faith wasn't misplaced? And all that time, Thomas had been dead, gone, beyond any hope of return. The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down her face in rivers she couldn't have stopped even if she'd wanted to. She wept for Thomas, for the man he'd been, for the future they dreamed of. for the life that had been cut short before it could begin. She wept for herself, for the years she'd wasted, the opportunities she'd missed, the woman she might have become if she hadn't been so determined to hold on to something that was already lost. And underneath the grief, rising like a tide she couldn't hold back, was something else, something that felt almost like relief. The not knowing was over. The endless uncertainty, the constant questioning, the terrible limbo of waiting without an answer, it was finally, mercifully finished. Thomas hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't chosen someone else. He hadn't decided she wasn't worth the effort. He had simply died, the way people died every day on the frontier, and the only cruelty was that no one had thought to tell her. Clara sank to her knees beside the fence post, her fingers digging into the cold earth. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. The moon rose and the stars emerged and the world continued turning, indifferent to her pain, and gradually the storm of her tears subsided into something quieter. Something that felt almost like peace. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff and her face was swollen, but something inside her felt different, lighter, as if she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't realized she was holding, and someone had finally given her permission to set it down. She looked at the fence post one last time, this marker that had defined her existence for 5 years. Then she turned and walked back to town, her steps steady, her head held high. She didn't look back. The days that followed were strange, suspended in a kind of twilight between the life Clara had been living and whatever came next. She went through the motions, teaching her classes, grading papers, nodding politely to the townspeople who greeted her, but everything felt muffled, distant, as if she were watching herself from very far away. She didn't tell anyone about the letter. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because the grief was still too raw, too private, to share with people who had spent 5 years pitying her. Perhaps because she didn't want their sympathy, didn't want to hear them say, "I told you so," or "at least now you know," or any of the other well-meaning platitudes that would only make her feel worse. Or perhaps because she was still processing it herself, still trying to understand what it meant, not just that Thomas was dead, but that she was free. Free from the waiting, free from the hope that had become its own kind of prison, free to become someone other than the woman who waited by the fence. But who was that woman? Clara didn't know. She had defined herself by her devotion for so long that she couldn't imagine what her life would look like without it. The fence post had been her North Star, her organizing principle, the thing that gave her days structure and meaning. Without it, she felt untethered, adrift. It was Noah who pulled her back. She visited the Miller farm 3 days after the cattle drive left, partly to check on the boy and partly because she needed to do something that wasn't wallowing in her own complicated feelings. Elizabeth welcomed her warmly, offering tea and fresh bread, and the comfortable chatter of a woman who understood that sometimes people needed company more than conversation. Noah was in the barn when Clara arrived, helping Samuel with the horses. Elizabeth led her out to watch, and Clara stood in the doorway as Noah carefully brushed a gray mare's coat, his small face serious with concentration. "He's a natural," Elizabeth said quietly. "Samuel says he's never seen a child take to animals so quickly. It's like they understand each other." Clara watched Noah's gentle hands move along the horse's flank, the way the animal leaned into his touch. "Has he talked much? About his mother? About what happened?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not yet. But we're not pushing. He'll open up when he's ready." As if sensing their attention, Noah looked up and saw Clara. His face transformed, breaking into a smile that made him look, for just a moment, like the child he was supposed to be instead of the small survivor he'd been forced to become. "Miss Whitfield." He handed the brush to Samuel and ran toward her, stopping just short of the doorway, as if suddenly uncertain of how to proceed. "You came to visit." "I promised I would." Clara crouched down to his level. "How are you settling in? Are the Millers treating you well?" Noah nodded eagerly. "Mrs. Miller makes the best biscuits I ever tasted, and Mr. Miller is teaching me about horses. And there's a loft in the barn where I can read, and they have a dog named Biscuit. That's funny, right? Biscuits and Biscuit. And I have my own bed with a real pillow and everything." The words tumbled out in a rush, a flood of details that spoke louder than any declaration of happiness could have. Clara felt her heart swell with something warm and fierce. "That sounds wonderful, Noah." "It is." He hesitated, then added more quietly, I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it'll be a dream, that I'll be back on the road alone, with nowhere to go. Clara reached out and took his hand. This isn't a dream. The Millers care about you. They want you here. Because of you. Noah's eyes were serious, too old for his young face. You made this happen. You found them for me. I just made an introduction. They're the ones who opened their hearts. Noah shook his head stubbornly. You saved me, Miss Whitfield. That man from the cattle drive. He was going to just leave me somewhere. You're the one who said I could stay, who found me a family. Clara didn't know what to say. She thought about Luke Hart standing apart from the other cowboys with his knowing eyes. She thought about his letter, still tucked in her pocket. The words burned into her memory. He had saved her too, in a way. Given her the truth she'd been too afraid to seek for herself. Maybe that was how it worked. Maybe people saved each other, one small act of kindness at a time, passing the gift forward like a flame passed from candle to candle. Will you come visit again? Noah asked. As often as I can. Clara squeezed his hand. And don't forget, when you're ready, there's a desk waiting for you at my school. Noah's smile returned, brighter than before. I'd like that. I haven't been to school in a long time, not since Ma got sick. Then we have a lot of catching up to do. She stayed for lunch, sitting around the Miller family's crowded table while children chattered and dishes were passed, and Elizabeth presided over it all with calm efficiency. Noah sat between the two middle Miller children, absorbed into the family as if he'd always been there, and Clara watched him laugh at a joke she didn't quite catch, and felt something inside her begin to heal. This was what mattered. Not the past, not the waiting, not the ghosts of men who couldn't return. This, the warmth of a family, the laughter of children, the simple act of being present in someone's life. This was what made existence worthwhile. For the first time in years, Clara began to believe she might have a future after all. The weeks passed, and Clara stopped going to the fence post. It wasn't a dramatic decision, not a line drawn in the sand. She simply found that her feet no longer carried her in that direction. The evenings that had once been devoted to watching the horizon were now spent grading papers or reading by lamplight, or walking to the Miller farm to visit Noah. The ritual that had defined her for 5 years faded away like morning mist, and in its place was something that felt almost like normalcy. The townspeople noticed, of course. They always noticed. Mrs. Henderson was the first to comment, stopping Clara outside the general store one afternoon with a knowing look in her eyes. You seem different lately, Miss Whitfield, if you don't mind me saying. Clara smiled, and for once it didn't feel forced. Different how? Lighter, more present. Mrs. Henderson hesitated. I haven't seen you at the fence post in weeks. Clara had known this conversation would come eventually. She had prepared herself for it, rehearsed what she would say, but now that the moment was here, she found she didn't need the rehearsed words. The man I was waiting for died, she said simply, 3 years ago, in a mining accident. I only just learned of it. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled with sympathy. Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. Thank you. But in a strange way, it's a relief. I know that sounds terrible, but the not knowing was the hardest part. At least now I understand why he never came. Mrs. Henderson reached out and touched Clara's arm. It doesn't sound terrible at all. Uncertainty is its own kind of torture. I'm glad you have answers, even if they're not the ones you hoped for. Clara nodded, surprised to find that she meant it when she said, So am I. Word spread through Copper Creek the way it always did, quietly, persistently, until everyone knew but no one quite remembered who had told them. The story of the waiting woman had a new ending now, and Clara could see it in the way people looked at her. The pity was still there, but it had transformed into something closer to respect. She had been faithful to the end. She had kept her vigil until the truth set her free. It was a better story than the one they'd been telling before. Clara supposed she should be grateful for that. She threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy. The children responded to her enthusiasm, their faces lighting up during lessons that had once felt like obligations. She introduced new subjects, poetry, geography, the basics of natural science, and watched as her students' curiosity bloomed like flowers after rain. Noah joined her class 3 weeks after arriving at the Miller farm. He He was behind in most subjects, his education interrupted by his mother's illness and death, but he attacked his studies with a determination that made Clara's heart ache with pride. He stayed after school most days, working through extra lessons, his small face fierce with concentration as he struggled to catch up to his classmates. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," Clara told him one afternoon, watching him labor over a particularly difficult arithmetic problem. "You've got plenty of time to learn." Noah shook his head without looking up. "I want to be smart. Ma always said education was the most important thing. She said it was the one thing nobody could take away from you." Clara thought of her own mother back in Boston, who had said almost exactly the same thing. "Your mother was a wise woman. She was the best." Noah's voice was matter of fact, but Clara heard the grief underneath. "She taught me to read before she got sick. Used to say I was the fastest learner she'd ever seen. She was right. You're one of the brightest students I've ever had." Noah looked up then, surprise flickering across his features. "Really? Really?" Clara smiled at him. "You're going to do great things someday, Noah Briggs. I'm certain of it." A flush crept up his cheeks, and he ducked his head back to his work. But Clara saw the way his shoulders straightened, the new confidence in the set of his jaw. Sometimes all a child needed was someone to believe in them, someone to see their potential and reflect it back. It was the same thing she had needed, Clara realized, the same thing Luke Hart had given her with his letter and his parting words. "You're stronger than you think." Maybe he was right. Maybe she was. Summer arrived in Copper Creek with a vengeance, the days stretching long and hot, the nights barely cool enough for sleep. School let out for the season, freeing Clara's students to help with farm work and leaving her with empty hours she wasn't sure how to fill. She spent most of her time at the Miller farm, helping Elizabeth with canning and preserving, watching Noah grow browner and stronger under the Wyoming sun. He had blossomed in the months since his arrival, the wariness in his eyes gradually giving way to the easy confidence of a child who knows he is loved. He called Elizabeth Mama Beth now, and Samuel Pa Miller, and Clara could see how much the names meant to all of them. "You've been good for him," Elizabeth said one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching Noah chase the Miller children through the fields. "He talks about you constantly. Miss Whitfield says this. Miss Whitfield told me that. You're his hero, you know." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "He's an easy child to care about." "He is, but it's more than that." Elizabeth's gaze was thoughtful. "You saw him when no one else did. When he was just a problem to be dealt with, a stowaway to be dropped somewhere and forgotten. You saw a boy who needed someone in his corner. That matters, Clara. That kind of seeing, it changes lives." Clara didn't know what to say. She watched Noah tackle one of the Miller boys, both of them dissolving into laughter as they tumbled through the grass. This moment, this simple, perfect moment of children playing on a summer afternoon, felt like a gift she didn't deserve. "I was lost," she said finally, the words coming slowly. "For 5 years I was lost. Stuck in a story that had already ended, waiting for a future that was never going to arrive. Noah gave me something to do besides wait. He gave me a reason to stop looking backward." Elizabeth nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Grief is a strange thing. Sometimes we need something to pull us forward before we can let go of what's behind us. "Is that what you think I've done? Let go?" "I think you're trying. I think you're further along than you realize." Elizabeth paused, then added gently, "And I think when you're ready, there's more waiting for you than just teaching and visiting. There's a whole life out there, Clara, a life you've been too afraid to imagine." Clara turned to look at her friend, questions rising to her lips. But before she could speak, a shout went up from the field. Noah, pointing toward the road, jumping up and down with excitement. "Someone's coming! Someone's riding this way!" Clara shaded her eyes against the sun, squinting at the distant figure on horseback. Just a traveler, probably, passing through on the way to somewhere else. Copper Creek saw its share of transients, especially in summer when the roads were clear and the weather was kind. But as the rider drew closer, something in Clara's chest began to tighten. Something about the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, the unhurried confidence of his approach. No, it couldn't be. The rider reached the fence that bordered the Miller property and reined in his horse, pushing his hat back on his head to reveal a face that Clara had seen only once but would have recognized anywhere. Luke Hart. He was thinner than she remembered, his face more weathered, as if the weeks since she'd seen him had been hard ones. But his eyes were the same, gentle, knowing, carrying secrets that weren't quite his to tell. Miss Whitfield. He touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Miller. I hope I'm not intruding. Elizabeth rose from her chair, her expression curious but welcoming. Mr. Hart, isn't it? The scout from the cattle drive? Yes, ma'am. I apologize for showing up unannounced. I was passing through the area and thought I'd check on the boy. Noah, wasn't it? As if summoned by his name, Noah came running toward the fence, the Miller children trailing behind him. Mr. Hart, you came back! Luke smiled, the first genuine smile Claire had seen from him, and swung down from his horse. I did. Look at you, son. You've grown a foot since I saw you last. At least 2 feet, Noah said proudly. I've been eating Mama Beth's cooking. She makes biscuits every morning. Is that so? Luke's gaze flickered to Clara, then back to Noah. Sounds like you've landed in a good place. The best place. Noah grabbed Luke's hand and tugged him toward the gate. Come see. I have my own horse now. Well, it's Pa Miller's horse, but he lets me ride him whenever I want. His name is Thunder, and he's the fastest horse in the whole territory. Clara watched as Noah dragged Luke toward the barn, chattering the whole way about Thunder's many excellent qualities. Her heart was beating too fast, her thoughts spinning in circles she couldn't quite control. He came back. Luke Hart came back. Why? Elizabeth appeared at her elbow, a knowing look on her face. Well, I had wondered when he might turn up again. Clara turned to stare at her. What do you mean? How would you know anything about... Clara? Elizabeth's voice was gentle. The man wrote you a letter that changed your life. He delayed an entire cattle drive so you could find Noah a home, and now he's ridden who knows how many miles to check on the boy? She raised an eyebrow. I may be a simple farm wife, but I know when a man has reasons he isn't saying out loud. Clara's face flushed hot. It's not. We barely know each other. He probably really is just checking on Noah. Elizabeth's tone made it clear she didn't believe a word. Well, whatever his reasons, I think you should talk to him. Alone, preferably. Without a bunch of children underfoot. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Elizabeth was already walking toward the barn, calling out that she needed to check on dinner preparations and would Mr. Hart like to stay for supper? Luke accepted the invitation, and Clara found herself sitting through the most surreal meal of her life. She watched him charm Elizabeth and earn Samuel's respect, and listened patiently to Noah's endless stories about Thunder and school and the fishing hole where the Miller boys had promised to take him once he learned to swim. He answered questions about the cattle drive, told stories about the trail that made the children gasp and giggle, and all the while his eyes kept finding Clara's across the table, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. After dinner, while the children helped Elizabeth clear the dishes, Luke asked Clara if she would walk with him. They wandered out to the far pasture, where the horses grazed in the golden evening light. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara was acutely aware of his presence beside her. The sound of his breathing, the creak of his leather boots, the way he seemed to take up space without demanding anything from it. You didn't just come to check on Noah, she said, finally. It wasn't a question, and Luke didn't pretend otherwise. No, I didn't. Then why? He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, rougher around the edges. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Clara's breath caught. Mr. Hart, Luke, please. He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. I know I have no right to say any of this. I know we've barely met, that I'm a stranger who inserted himself into your life uninvited. But I've spent the past weeks trying to convince myself to stay away, and I can't do it. I can't ride past this town without stopping. I can't pass through this territory without wondering how you are, what you're doing, whether you've read that letter I gave you, and what you thought of it. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. I read it. Of course I read it. And? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara thought about all the things she could say, that she was grateful, that the truth had set her free, that she had spent 5 years waiting for one man and wasn't ready to think about another. But what came out was something different, something truer. I felt relieved, she whispered. That's terrible, isn't it? Thomas died and I felt relieved. Luke shook his head. There's nothing terrible about it. You were grieving long before you knew what you were grieving for. The relief isn't about his death. It's about finally knowing, finally being able to stop waiting. Clara blinked back tears. How do you understand that? How do you understand any of this? Because I've been there. Luke's voice was steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath it. I spent 3 years looking for someone who didn't want to be found. My sister. She ran off with a man who promised her the world, and I chased every rumor, followed every lead, burned through every cent I had trying to bring her home. By the time I finally caught up with her, she was married with a baby on the way, and she looked me in the eye and told me to stop, that she'd chosen her life, and I needed to choose mine. Clara stared at him. What did you do? I stopped. I let go. I accepted that I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and sometimes I still dream about knocking on her door and trying one more time. But she was right. I was so busy chasing after her that I'd forgotten how to live my own life. Clara understood then why he had given her the letter, why he had challenged her about the difference between waiting and hiding. It wasn't judgment, it was recognition. He had seen himself in her standing at that fence post, and he had wanted to offer her the gift someone had given him, permission to stop. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth, for giving me the letter, for all of it. Luke's eyes softened. You don't have to thank me. I want to. Clara hesitated, then added, and I want you to know, I don't think you're a stranger, not anymore. Something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, or something even more fragile. I'm taking a job as foreman at the Peterson Ranch, he said. It's about 5 miles from here, close enough to visit town, close enough to see how that boy is doing at the Miller place. He paused. Close enough to see you, if you're willing. Clara's pulse quickened. Why would you do that? Give up the trail, settle down in a place you barely know. Because I spent 10 years moving, and I'm tired. Because I've been looking for something to anchor myself to, and I think I might have found it. His gaze held hers. Because when I saw you standing at that fence post, looking at the horizon like you were waiting for the whole world to change, I thought, there's a woman who understands. There's a woman who knows what it means to hope for something so hard it becomes your whole life. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not that woman anymore. I don't know who I am now. That's all right. Luke's voice was soft. You've got time to figure it out. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be around while you do. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a proposal or a promise. It was something simpler, more honest, an offer of presence, of patience, of the chance to see where this strange connection between them might lead. Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who had chased his own ghosts and learned to let them go. A man who understood loss and loneliness and the courage it took to start again. A man who had ridden back to a town where he knew no one, just to see if a woman he barely knew was finding her way out of the darkness. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt something stir in her chest that wasn't grief or obligation or the stubborn determination to keep waiting. It was something warmer, something that looked, against all odds, like the beginning of hope. I'd like that, she said quietly. I think I'd like that very much. Luke smiled, a real smile this time, one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. Then I'll see you soon, Miss Whitfield. Clara, she corrected. If we're going to be, whatever we're going to be, you should call me Clara. Clara. He said her name like he was tasting it, testing the weight of it on his tongue. I'll see you soon, Clara. He touched his hat in that way he had, then turned and walked back toward the farmhouse where his horse was waiting. Clara watched him go, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if this man would become something important in her life, or if he would fade away like so many other possibilities that had crossed her path. But for the first time in 5 years, she was willing to find out. For the first time in 5 years, she was ready to stop waiting and start living. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Clara stood in the pasture and watched the colors deepen, feeling the Wyoming wind on her face, and let herself imagine a future that didn't end at a weathered fence post. It was, she realized, the first time she'd let herself imagine anything at all. And that, perhaps, was the biggest change of all. The Peterson Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of Wyoming grassland, a patchwork of pastures and corrals that had seen better days before old man Peterson's arthritis forced him to hire outside help. Luke arrived on a Tuesday morning with everything he owned packed into saddlebags and a bedroll, and by sundown he had already mended 2 sections of broken fence and reorganized the feed storage in the main barn. Clara heard about his arrival from Mrs. Henderson, who had heard it from the postmaster, who had heard it from one of the Peterson ranch hands who'd come into town for supplies. Small towns had a way of turning every newcomer into public property, their comings and goings tracked and analyzed with the dedication of census takers. "They say he's a hard worker," Mrs. Henderson reported, leaning across the counter of the general store with the gleam of a woman who loved a good story. "Already got the other hand straightening up, acting like they've got something to prove. Mr. Peterson told my husband he hasn't seen anyone take charge so naturally since his own father ran the place." Clara nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral, even as her heart did a small, traitorous leap. "That's good to hear. The Peterson Ranch could use someone capable." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed with knowing amusement. "I also heard he's been asking about you, wanting to know your schedule, when you might be at the Miller farm, that sort of thing." The heat that crept up Clara's neck had nothing to do with the summer weather. "I'm sure he's just being friendly. We barely know each other." "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she didn't believe a word of it. "Well, if you happen to be at the Miller place this Sunday, I imagine you might run into him. Word is he's planning to stop by to see that boy you helped settle there." Clara purchased her supplies and left before Mrs. Henderson could extract any more reactions from her. But as she walked back to her room above the store, she found herself counting the days until Sunday with an anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent 5 years waiting for a man who would never come. The idea of hoping for someone new, of opening herself up to possibility again, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether to jump. But Luke had jumped first. He had given up the trail, taken a job nearby, made it clear that he wanted to know her better. The least she could do was meet him halfway. Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that made Clara believe the universe might actually be paying attention. She dressed carefully, choosing a blue cotton dress that brought out her eyes and arranging her hair in a style that was neat but not overly fussy. She told herself she was just visiting Noah, just checking on the Miller family, just enjoying a day in the country. She wasn't fooling anyone, least of all herself. Luke was already at the farm when she arrived, standing in the paddock with Noah and one of the Miller boys, demonstrating something about horse care that had both children hanging on his every word. He looked up when Clara's buggy appeared, and even from a distance she could see the way his face changed, the subtle softening around his eyes, the slight curve of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but held all the warmth of one. "Miss Whitfield." He walked to meet her as she climbed down from the buggy, his long stride eating up the ground between them. "I was hoping you'd come by today. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might be here." Clara was proud of how steady her voice sounded. "I thought I'd check on Noah." "Of course." The knowing glint in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. "He's been telling me about school, says you're the best teacher in Wyoming." "I'm the only teacher in Copper Creek. The competition is limited." Luke laughed, a warm sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I don't think that's why he says it. That boy thinks the sun rises and sets on you." Clara felt her cheeks flush with pleasure. "He's easy to care about. Any teacher would feel the same." "No." Luke's voice was gentle but certain. "Not any teacher, you." Before Clara could respond, Noah came running toward them, his face alight with excitement. "Miss Whitfield, did you see? Mr. Hart is teaching me how to check a horse's hooves for stones. It's really important because if you don't do it, the horse could go lame and then it can't work anymore, and that's bad for everyone." Clara smiled at his enthusiasm. "That does sound important. Are you being a good student?" "The best," Noah declared. "Mr. Hart says I'm a natural. He says I've got good hands for horses. Luke ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. I said you've got the makings of a good horseman if you keep practicing. Don't go putting words in my mouth. Noah grinned, unrepentant. Same thing. Elizabeth appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and calling everyone in for lemonade. The afternoon unfolded in a series of small, perfect moments. Cold drinks on the shaded porch, children's laughter floating up from the yard, easy conversation that wandered from topic to topic without ever feeling forced. Clara found herself watching Luke as he talked, noticing the way he listened when others spoke, the patience he showed with the children's endless questions, the respect he offered to Samuel and Elizabeth. He was a man comfortable in his own skin, she realized, a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was a stark contrast to Thomas, who had been all charm and big promises, always talking about what he would do someday, always reaching for the next horizon. Luke seemed content with where he was, focused on the work in front of him rather than distant dreams. Maybe that was what drew her to him, or maybe it was simply that he saw her, really saw her, in a way that Thomas never had. When the afternoon began to fade toward evening, Luke offered to escort Clara back to town. She accepted, telling herself it was practical rather than romantic, that the roads could be dangerous for a woman alone at dusk. They rode side by side, their horses keeping an easy pace as the sun dipped toward the mountains. For a long time, neither of them spoke, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said finally. Luke glanced at her. "Anything. That letter you gave me, about Thomas." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "How did you know it was the right thing to do, telling me the truth like that?" Luke was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "I didn't know. Not for certain. But I kept thinking about what I would have wanted, if I'd been in your place. And the answer was always the same. I would have wanted to know. Even if it hurt, even if it changed everything." It did change everything. For better or worse. Clara considered the question. A month ago, she might not have been able to answer. But now, with the fence post behind her and something new beginning to take shape ahead, she found the words came easily. Better. Definitely better. She looked at him, feeling brave. Though I suppose that depends on what happens next. Luke's expression was unreadable, but his voice was soft when he spoke. What do you want to happen next? It was the question Clara had been asking herself for weeks, the question she had been afraid to answer, afraid even to consider. But something about this man, his steadiness, his honesty, the way he seemed willing to wait for her to find her footing, made her want to try. "I want to stop being afraid," she said. "I want to believe that the future can be different from the past. I want to let myself hope for something without feeling like I'm setting myself up for disappointment." "That's a lot of wanting." "I know." Clara smiled ruefully. "I'm not very good at it yet, the hoping part. I spent so long waiting for something specific that I forgot how to want anything else." Luke reined in his horse and Clara did the same, both of them stopping in the middle of the empty road. The sun was balanced on the edge of the mountains now, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I'm not Thomas," Luke said quietly. "I'm not going to make you promises about land and cabins and futures that might not come true. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, or next month, or next year. All I know is that I'd like to find out with you, if you'll let me." Clara's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was the moment, the cliff edge, the choice to jump or step back. She thought about Thomas, buried in an unmarked grave in Colorado. She thought about the 5 years she had spent waiting, the life she had put on hold, the woman she had become in the shadow of absence. She thought about Noah, finding a new family against all odds, about Elizabeth, building a life out of hard work and love, about all the people who had taken chances, risked heartbreak, opened themselves up to possibility. And she thought about Luke, steady, patient Luke, who had ridden back to a town where he knew no one, just to see if she might be ready to try again. "I'd like that too," she heard herself say. "Finding out together." The smile that spread across Luke's face was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. He didn't reach for her, didn't make any grand gestures. He simply nodded, his eyes bright with something that looked like joy. "Then that's what we'll do." They rode the rest of the way to town in comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them. A door had opened. A possibility had been acknowledged, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt like she was moving towards something rather than waiting for it to arrive. The weeks that followed were like a slow awakening. Luke came to town regularly, always finding reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or the general store or wherever Clara happened to be. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie, books he'd borrowed from the Peterson family library, news about the ranch and the horses and the progress he was making. But more than that, he brought conversation. Long, wandering talks about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, the places they'd been, and the places they hoped to go. Clara found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, secrets and sorrows she had kept locked away for years. And Luke listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel seen and valued and understood. She learned about his past in fragments, pieced together from stories he offered during quiet moments. He had grown up on a farm in Missouri, the oldest of 4 children. His father had died when Luke was 16, leaving him to help his mother hold things together. He had worked cattle drives since he was old enough to sit a horse, learning the skills that would make him one of the most respected scouts on the frontier. And she learned about his sister, Emma, the one he had chased for 3 years, trying to bring her home. He didn't talk about her often, but when he did, Clara could hear the old pain underneath his words. The guilt of not being able to save her. The grief of accepting that she didn't want to be saved. "Do you ever hear from her now?" Clara asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the schoolhouse watching the stars emerge. Luke shook his head. "Not in years. Last I heard, she was living somewhere in California. 2 children, maybe 3 by now. Her husband turned out to be decent enough, I suppose. Not the man I would have chosen for her, but not the monster I'd feared either." "Do you regret it? Stopping the search?" "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. "Mostly I regret how long it took me to understand that it wasn't my choice to make. Emma was a grown woman. She had the right to live her own life, make her own mistakes. I was so busy trying to protect her that I never stopped to ask if she wanted protection." Clara thought about her own situation, the way she had clung to her vigil, refusing to consider that Thomas might not want to be waited for, the way she had made her waiting into a kind of identity, a purpose that defined her even as it kept her trapped. "I think I understand," she said slowly, "about holding on too tight, about not knowing when to let go." Luke turned to look at her, his expression soft in the starlight. "The thing I've learned is that letting go isn't the same as giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do, trusting that things will work out, even if you can't control how." Clara considered this. "Is that what you're doing with me? Letting go of control?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm trying, though I won't pretend it's easy. There's a part of me that wants to rush things, push for more than you're ready to give. But I know that's not what you need. What you need is time, space, the chance to figure out who you are without anyone else's expectations weighing you down." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding. This was what had been missing with Thomas, this patience, this willingness to let her be herself instead of the woman he wanted her to be. Thomas had swept her off her feet with passion and promises, but he had never taken the time to really know her. Luke was different. Luke saw her clearly, flaws and all, and chose to stay anyway. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." Luke reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against hers. "Thank you for letting me try." They sat there in the gathering darkness, hands intertwined, and Clara felt something settle into place inside her. Not passion exactly, that would come later, building slowly like embers catching fire, but something deeper, more solid. The foundation of something that could last. Noah noticed the change in Clara before anyone else did. Children had a way of seeing what adults tried to hide, their minds uncluttered by social conventions and polite pretenses. "You smile different now," he told her one afternoon, after a particularly successful arithmetic lesson. "Bigger. Like you mean it more." Clara laughed, caught off guard by his perception. "Do I? I hadn't noticed." "It's because of Mr. Hart, isn't it?" Noah's expression was knowing beyond his years. "Mama Beth says he's sweet on you. She says it's about time you had someone to look after you." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mrs. Miller said that?" She says lots of things when she doesn't think I'm listening. Noah grinned impishly. She also says Mr. Hart is a good man and you'd be foolish to let him get away. Well, Clara struggled to regain her composure. I'll have to have a word with Mrs. Miller about discussing my personal affairs. What are personal affairs? Clara smiled despite herself. Never mind. Now, how about we work on your spelling? But as she guided Noah through his lessons, Clara found her thoughts drifting to what Elizabeth had said. A good man. Someone to look after her. It was strange to think of herself as someone who needed looking after. She had been self-sufficient for so long, standing alone against the world and its whispers. Yet there was something appealing about the idea of partnership, not dependence, but interdependence. Two people choosing to face life together, each one stronger for the other's presence. Was that what she and Luke were building? It was too soon to say for certain, but the possibility made her heart feel lighter than it had in years. Summer ripened into the full heat of August, the days long and golden and heavy with the hum of insects in the tall grass. Clara fell into a rhythm, teaching, visiting the Miller farm, spending time with Luke whenever their schedules aligned. They took walks along the creek that wound through the valley, talking for hours while their horses grazed nearby. They attended church together on Sundays, sitting side by side in the plain wooden pews, while Mrs. Henderson watched with barely concealed satisfaction. They shared meals at the Miller farm, where Noah insisted on sitting between them and regaling them with stories about thunder and school and the many adventures he was having in his new life. And slowly, gradually, Clara felt herself beginning to heal. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, not a single moment of revelation that changed everything. It was more like watching a wound close day by day, the raw edges drawing together until what remained was just a scar, still visible, still tender to the touch, but no longer bleeding. She stopped dreaming about Thomas. For years he had haunted her sleep, appearing in fragments of memory that left her waking with tear-stained cheeks. But now, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of other things. The schoolhouse, Noah's laughter, the way Luke's hand felt wrapped around hers. She started making plans again. Small ones at first. Books she wanted to read, lessons she wanted to try with her students, improvements she wanted to make to her teaching methods. But gradually the plans grew larger, reaching further into a future she was beginning to believe in. And she found herself one evening, standing in front of the mirror in her small room, looking at her reflection and seeing someone new, not the waiting woman anymore. Not the foolish girl who had followed a man across the country on the strength of 3 letters and a handful of promises. But a woman who had survived loss and loneliness and uncertainty and had come out the other side stronger. A woman who was finally ready to live. The shift happened so gradually that Clara almost didn't notice it. But one day in late August, she realized that when she thought about the future, Luke was in it. Not as a vague possibility, not as a hopeful maybe, but as a certainty, as fixed and real as the mountains on the horizon. She loved him. The realization didn't come with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It came quietly, settling into her heart like a bird returning to its nest. She loved his patience and his steadiness, the way he treated Noah like a son, the respect he showed to everyone he met. She loved the sound of his laugh and the warmth of his presence, and the way he looked at her like she was the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen. But more than that, she loved who she was becoming with him. He didn't ask her to be anyone other than herself. He didn't need her to perform or pretend or meet some impossible standard. He simply loved her, flaws and fears and all. And in that love, she found the freedom to finally love herself. Clara didn't tell him right away. The words felt too big, too important to rush. She wanted to be sure, not of him, but of herself. After 5 years of building her life around an illusion, she needed to know that this was real, that it would last. So she waited. But this time, the waiting was different. This time, she was waiting for the right moment, not an uncertain someday. This time, she knew what she was waiting for, and she knew it would come. And when it did, she would be ready. The right moment came on a Sunday evening in early September, when the first hints of autumn were beginning to touch the Wyoming landscape. The leaves hadn't turned yet, but there was a crispness in the air, a sense of change gathering just beyond the horizon. Clara and Luke had spent the day at the Miller farm, helping with the last of the summer harvest. Noah had worked alongside them, proudly carrying baskets of vegetables to the storage cellar and declaring himself the strongest 8-year-old in the territory. The Miller children had laughed and challenged him to prove it, and the afternoon had dissolved into games and laughter and the kind of simple joy that Clara had almost forgotten existed. Now, as the sun began to set, Clara and Luke walked along the fence line at the edge of the property, their hands loosely intertwined. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sounds of evening, crickets singing, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through the grass. "I want to tell you something," Clara said, breaking the silence. Luke glanced at her, his expression open and attentive. "I'm listening." Clara stopped walking, turning to face him. The setting sun painted his face in shades of gold, highlighting the lines around his eyes, and the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair. He was beautiful, she thought, not in the way Thomas had been beautiful, flashy and charming and impossible to hold, but beautiful in a deeper way, the beauty of something solid and true. "I love you," she said. The words came out simpler than she had expected, without the grand speeches she had imagined. But they were enough. They were everything. Luke's face transformed. The careful control he usually maintained seemed to crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. He raised his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek like she was something precious. "Clara," his voice was rough, "I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing at that fence post. I have loved you through every conversation, every silence, every moment we've spent together. I have loved you when I had no right to, when I told myself to keep my distance, when I thought you could never feel the same." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for once, they weren't tears of grief. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it, to feel it." "Don't apologize." Luke wiped her tears away with his thumb. "You needed time. You needed to heal, and I would have waited for you forever." "You don't have to wait anymore." His smile was like sunrise after a long night. "No, I don't." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, and Clara felt the last of her walls come tumbling down. This was what she had been waiting for all along, she realized. Not Thomas, not the future he had promised, but this. The feeling of being truly known and truly loved. The feeling of coming home. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had slipped below the horizon and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Clara laughed, giddy with joy, and Luke laughed with her, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a Wyoming pasture, drunk on love and possibility and the simple miracle of finding each other. "What happens now?" Clara asked, when the laughter had faded into smiles. Luke took both her hands in his. "Now we take it one day at a time. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, or tomorrow, or even next month. We just have to keep choosing each other, keep showing up, keep building something together." Clara nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. One day at a time. It was so different from the way she had lived before, always waiting for some distant future, always hoping for something that might never arrive. But it felt right. It felt real. "I can do that," she said, "one day at a time." Luke raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, first one and then the other. "Then that's what we'll do." They walked back to the farmhouse hand in hand, the stars wheeling overhead and the future stretching before them like an open road. Noah ran out to meet them, chattering about something the Miller boys had said, and Elizabeth appeared on the porch with a knowing smile. And Clara felt for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not waiting for something better, not hoping for something different, just here, just now, just home. Autumn arrived in Wyoming like a painter with a generous hand, splashing the landscape with shades of gold and crimson and burnt orange. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the valley took on the particular beauty of a world preparing for sleep. Clara watched the transformation from the schoolhouse window, her heart full in a way it had never been before. The weeks since her confession had passed like a dream. Luke came to town whenever his duties at the Peterson ranch allowed, and each visit deepened the connection between them. They talked for hours, sharing stories and silences, building the kind of intimacy that comes only from choosing someone again and again. Clara had never known love could feel like this. Not the desperate, clinging hope she had felt for Thomas, but something steadier, something that grew stronger with each passing day. Noah flourished alongside her happiness, as if the boy could sense the shift in the air and was responding to it. His grades improved, his confidence blossomed, and he spoke of the Millers with the easy affection of a child who finally felt secure. He had started calling Elizabeth Ma without the Beth attached, and Samuel had become simply Pa. The transition had happened so naturally that Clara almost missed it. One day Noah was a frightened orphan clinging to her hand, and the next he was a Miller in everything but name. He asked me about adoption, Elizabeth confided one October afternoon as she and Clara sat on the farmhouse porch watching Noah race through fallen leaves with the other children. Said he wanted to know if we could make it official, if he could really be ours forever. Clara felt her throat tighten. What did you tell him? I told him he's already ours. Elizabeth's voice was thick with emotion. Papers or no papers, that boy is my son. But Samuel is looking into the legal side of things. We want him to have our name, our protection. We want him to know that nothing will ever take him away from us. Clara blinked back tears. He deserves that. After everything he's been through, he deserves to know he belongs somewhere. Elizabeth reached over and squeezed her hand. He belongs to all of us, Clara. You're as much a part of his family as anyone. Don't ever forget that. The word stayed with Clara as she rode back to town that evening. Family. It was such a simple word, but it carried so much weight. For 5 years, she had been alone, not just physically, but emotionally. She had held herself apart from the people around her, maintaining a careful distance as if getting too close might somehow betray the man she was waiting for. But Thomas was gone, and Clara was finally learning what it meant to let people in. Elizabeth and Samuel, Noah, Luke, even Mrs. Henderson and the other townspeople who had watched her vigil with a mixture of pity and respect. They were all part of her life now, woven into the fabric of her days in ways she hadn't allowed before. She wasn't alone anymore, and the realization was both terrifying and wonderful. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning of what was to come. Clara watched it fall through the schoolhouse window, her students' voices a pleasant hum in the background, and felt a prickle of unease. Winter in Wyoming was no small thing. The storms could be brutal, cutting off roads and isolating ranches for weeks at a time. Luke had warned her about it, explaining that once the heavy snows started, his trips to town would become less frequent. The Peterson Ranch was 5 miles from Copper Creek, but in bad weather, those 5 miles might as well be 50. I don't want you to worry, he had said, his hands warm around hers. I'll come when I can. And when I can't, you'll know I'm thinking of you every moment. Clara had nodded, telling herself she understood. But as she watched the first flakes drift past the window, she felt the old fear stirring in her chest. The fear of waiting. The fear of silence. The fear of loving someone who was beyond her reach. She pushed the feeling down, reminding herself that this was different. Luke wasn't Thomas. He wasn't going to disappear into the wilderness and never return. He was just a few miles away doing honest work, building the kind of life that would let them be together properly. But the fear didn't listen to reason. It never did. November brought storms that tested the valley's resolve. The snow fell thick and fast, piling up in drifts that reached the windows of the lower buildings and turning the roads into treacherous ribbons of ice and mud. School was canceled for days at a time, and Clara found herself trapped in her room above the general store, watching the white world outside and trying not to count the days since she had last seen Luke. He had come to town just before the first major storm, his face ruddy with cold and his horse's coat thick with frost. They had spent a precious few hours together, walking through the empty streets and talking about everything and nothing. When he left, he had kissed her with a fierce tenderness that made her knees weak. I'll be back as soon as the road's clear, he promised. Wait for me. Wait for me. The words echoed in Clara's mind as the days stretched into a week, then 2. She knew he was safe. Travelers who made it through the passes brought news from the outlying ranches, and the Peterson place was weathering the winter well. But knowing wasn't the same as seeing. Knowing wasn't the same as feeling his hand in hers, hearing his voice, being reminded that he was real and present and hers. Clara tried to fill the empty hours with useful work. She planned lessons, graded papers, mended clothes that had been waiting for attention since summer. She visited the general store every day, buying things she didn't need just for the excuse to talk to someone. She even started writing letters, long, rambling missives that she addressed to Luke but never sent, pouring her heart onto paper as if the act of writing could bridge the distance between them. But the loneliness crept in anyway, settling into her bones like the cold. And with it came the old doubts, the old fears, the old questions she thought she had finally put to rest. What if he didn't come back? What if the winter was just the beginning and the distance between them would only grow? What if she had let herself hope again, only to have hope betrayed a second time? Clara knew these thoughts were irrational. She knew Luke loved her, knew he would move mountains to be with her if he could. But knowing and feeling were two different things, and in the long, dark nights of winter, feeling was what ruled her heart. The letter from Boston arrived on a day when the snow had finally paused, leaving the world buried under a blanket of white silence. Clara recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, the elegant loops and precise spacing that spoke of a woman who had never quite reconciled herself to her daughter's decision to stay in the West. She opened it with trembling fingers, not sure what to expect. Her correspondence with her family had become sporadic over the years, reduced to obligatory updates on holidays and birthdays. They had never forgiven her for choosing Thomas over them, and even after she'd stopped mentioning him in her letters, the distance had remained. The letter was longer than usual, covering 3 pages in her mother's careful script. Clara read it standing in the middle of the general store, oblivious to Mrs. Henderson's curious glances. Her father was ill. Not dangerously so, her mother hastened to add, but enough to make him think about the future, about the family he had left, about the daughter who had gone west and never returned. He asks about you, her mother wrote, more often than he used to. I think he regrets the harsh words he spoke when you left. I think we both do. We were so sure you were making a mistake, so certain that you would come crawling back when your soldier abandoned you. But you didn't come back. You stayed, and you built a life, and perhaps that took more courage than we gave you credit for. Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. Your father wants to see you, the letter continued. He won't say it outright. You know how he is, but I can tell. If you could find it in your heart to visit, even just for a few weeks, I think it would mean more to him than he could ever express. More to both of us. Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Her mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other in a confused rush. Visit Boston, see her parents, face the family she had left behind for a man who had never come for her. A month ago, the idea would have filled her with dread. She had constructed her life in Copper Creek so carefully, building walls between herself and everything that reminded her of her past. Going back would mean tearing those walls down, confronting the woman she had been and the choices she had made. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't the foolish girl who had chased a dream across the country. She was Clara Whitfield, schoolteacher, beloved by her students, respected by her community. A woman who had survived loss and found love again. A woman who had finally learned to stop waiting and start living. Maybe it was time to show her parents who she had become. Luke arrived in town 3 days later, looking exhausted but determined. He had ridden through snow that reached his horse's belly, pushing through drifts that would have stopped lesser men. When Clara saw him walk into the general store, stamping snow from his boots and scanning the room until his eyes found hers, she felt her heart crack open with relief. Luke. She was in his arms before she knew she had moved, pressing her face against his chest, breathing in the smell of snow and leather and horse and him. You came. I promised I would. His voice was rough, his arms tight around her. The roads were bad, but I couldn't stay away any longer. I had to see you. They found a quiet corner in the back of the store, Mrs. Henderson tactfully disappearing to check on inventory that didn't need checking. Clara told Luke about the letter, about her father's illness, about the invitation to visit. What do you want to do? He asked, his eyes searching her face. Clara considered the question. What did she want? She wanted to stay here, in this town that had become home. She wanted to spend every day with Luke, building the future they had begun to imagine together. She wanted to watch Noah grow up, to teach her students, to be part of the community that had finally accepted her. But she also wanted to see her parents, to make peace with her past, to show them that their daughter had found her way, even if it wasn't the way they had expected. I want to go, she said slowly, but I'm afraid. Of what? Of going backward. Of getting pulled back into who I used to be. Clara met his eyes. I spent so long being the girl who waited for Thomas. I don't want to become her again. Luke took her hands in his grip warm and steady. Clara, you could never go backward. Not now. You've grown too much, changed too much. Going home isn't about who you were. It's about showing them who you've become. Clara felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. He was right. She wasn't the same person who had left Boston 5 years ago. She had been forged by loss and loneliness, tempered by years of waiting, and finally refined by love. Going home wouldn't erase that. Nothing could erase that. Will you wait for me? She asked, the words carrying an echo of another time, another conversation, another man who had asked her to believe. But Luke's answer was different from Thomas's promises. It was simpler and truer. I'll be here, he said, however long it takes. I'll be right here. The preparations for Clara's journey took longer than expected. Winter travel was complicated and expensive, requiring careful planning and significant resources. Luke insisted on helping with the costs, which Clara resisted at first. I can manage on my own, she told him. I've been managing for 5 years. I know you can. Luke's voice was patient. But you don't have to. Let me help. Let me be part of this. In the end, Clara relented. Not because she needed his money, but because she understood what he was really offering: partnership. The chance to face her past with someone by her side, even if that someone couldn't physically make the journey with her. She booked passage on a stagecoach heading east, scheduled to leave in mid-December. That would give her time to visit Boston over the holidays and return before the worst of the winter weather hit in January and February. It wasn't a lot of time, but it was enough. Enough to see her parents, to say the things that needed saying, to close the chapter on a past she had been running from for too long. The days before her departure were bittersweet. Clara threw herself into preparations, but she also savored every moment with the people she loved. She spent extra time at the schoolhouse, making sure her students had enough work to keep them busy during her absence. She visited the Miller farm multiple times, soaking in Noah's chatter and Elizabeth's warmth and Samuel's quiet steadiness. And she spent every possible minute with Luke. They talked about everything: their hopes for the future, their fears about the present, the life they wanted to build together. Luke told her more about the Peterson Ranch, about his plans to eventually have his own place. Clara told him about Boston, about the family she had left behind, about the complicated tangle of love and resentment that had defined her relationship with her parents. What will you tell them? Luke asked one evening, as they sat by the fire in the general store's back room. About us, I mean. Claire considered the question. The truth, that I've met someone, that I'm happy. And what about Thomas? The name no longer carried the weight it once had. Thomas was a chapter in her story, important but finished. He had shaped her, changed her, led her to this place. But he wasn't the end of her story. He was just a part of it. I'll tell them he's gone, Clara said, that I mourned him and moved on. That's all they need to know. Luke nodded, something like relief flickering across his features. Good. I don't want to compete with a ghost. You're not competing with anyone. Clara reached out and took his hand. You're not a replacement for Thomas, Luke. You're something entirely different, something better. Better how? Thomas was a dream, beautiful and exciting and ultimately impossible. You're real. Clara smiled. You showed up. You stayed. You didn't ask me to wait for something that might never come. You just came. Do you know how much that means to someone who spent 5 years hoping and being disappointed? Luke's eyes were bright in the firelight. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Whatever happens in Boston, whatever your parents say or think, I'll be here when you get back. I know. And she did know. That was the miracle of it, the certainty that had replaced the doubt, the trust that had grown where fear once lived. That's why I can go, because I know you'll be here. The night before Clara's departure, Luke gave her a gift. It was small, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, and he pressed it into her hands with an expression that was almost shy. Open it when you're on the road, he said. When you're missing home. Clara turned the package over, feeling its weight. What is it? A reminder. Luke smiled. "Of what's waiting for you when you get back." She wanted to open it immediately, but something in his expression told her to wait. So she tucked it into her traveling bag, next to the letters she had written and never sent, and promised herself she would follow his instructions. The stagecoach left at dawn, the air so cold that Clara's breath formed clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. Luke was there to see her off, along with Mrs. Henderson and a few other townspeople who had gathered despite the early hour. Noah had wanted to come too, but Elizabeth had judged it too cold for him and promised to bring him to wave from the road instead. Clara hugged Mrs. Henderson, thanked the well-wishers, and then turned to Luke. He stood apart from the others, his hat pulled low against the cold, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart ache. "Be safe," he said. "I will. Come back to me. I promise." He kissed her then, in front of everyone, a kiss that was tender and fierce and full of all the words they hadn't said. Clara felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she pulled away, felt the cold seep into the places where his warmth had been. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too." Luke stepped back, his face carefully composed. "Now go, before I change my mind and drag you off this coach." Clara laughed despite herself, wiping her tears with a gloved hand. She climbed into the stagecoach, settled into her seat, and pressed her face to the window as the driver called to the horses. The coach lurched forward, and Clara watched Luke grow smaller in the distance, a dark figure against the white landscape, one hand raised in farewell. She watched until he was just a speck, then nothing at all, swallowed by the vastness of the Wyoming winter. Then she turned to face forward, toward the rising sun and the long road east, toward Boston, toward her past, toward the conversation that had been 5 years in the making. Clara opened Luke's gift on the second day of her journey, when the loneliness had begun to settle in and the unfamiliar landscape outside the coach window made her chest tight with something like homesickness. Inside the brown paper was a small wooden box, smoothly polished and hinged with tiny brass fittings. Clara opened it carefully, her breath catching as she saw what lay inside. A ring. Not an engagement ring. Luke had been clear that he wouldn't pressure her, that they would take things at whatever pace felt right. This was something different. A simple band of silver set with a small turquoise stone the color of a Wyoming summer sky. Underneath the ring was a folded note, written in Luke's careful hand. "This belonged to my mother. She wore it every day of her married life, and when she died, she asked me to give it to someone who made me believe in the future again. I wasn't sure I ever would. But then I met you, standing at that fence post, and everything changed. This ring isn't a proposal. It's a promise that I'll be here, waiting, for as long as it takes. Come home to me, Clara. Come home." Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the cool weight of it settle against her skin. She pressed it to her lips, imagining she could feel Luke's warmth in the metal. Then she tucked the note into her pocket, next to her mother's letter, and watched the landscape roll past. She was going home, but for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what that word meant. And it wasn't Boston. It was Luke. It was Noah. It was the schoolhouse and the Miller farm and the weathered fence post that had taught her how to wait. It was Wyoming, and she would return to it, no matter what. The journey east was long and arduous, the stagecoach bouncing over frozen roads that seemed designed to jar every bone in Clara's body. But she barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was too full of other things. The ring on her finger, the letter in her pocket, the conversation she would soon have with parents she hadn't seen in half a decade. She had left Boston as a girl, chasing a dream that had promised her everything and delivered nothing. She was returning as a woman, carrying the weight of experience and the light of new love. She didn't know how her parents would receive her. She didn't know if the old wounds could be healed, if the harsh words could be forgiven, if the distance could be bridged. But she was going to try. Because that was what she had learned in Wyoming, that trying was everything. That hope wasn't foolish if you were willing to work for it. That love wasn't weakness if it made you stronger. Thomas had taught her how to wait. Luke had taught her how to live. And now it was time to put those lessons to use. Clara pressed her hand against the window of the stagecoach, feeling the cold glass beneath her palm. Somewhere behind her, Wyoming was sleeping under its blanket of snow, Somewhere behind her, Luke was working and waiting, keeping his promise. Somewhere behind her was home, and she would return to it. She would always return to it. Boston in December was exactly as Clara remembered. Gray skies pressing down on cobblestone streets, the smell of coal smoke and sea salt mingling in the frozen air, the constant bustle of a city that never seemed to sleep. Yet everything felt different, smaller somehow, more confined. After 5 years in Wyoming's open spaces, the narrow streets and crowded buildings made Clara feel like she was breathing through a cloth. The Whitfield home stood on Beacon Hill, a respectable brownstone that had housed 3 generations of her family. Clara stood on the sidewalk across the street, her traveling bag at her feet, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The windows glowed with lamplight, warm and inviting, and she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Her parents, going about their evening routine, unaware that their prodigal daughter was standing just 50 feet away. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she had walked out that door with Thomas Callahan's letters in her pocket and dreams of the West in her heart. 5 years since her father had called her a fool and her mother had wept and begged her to reconsider. 5 years since she had chosen love over family, adventure over security, hope over certainty. And now here she was, returning not in defeat, but in triumph, though her parents wouldn't see it that way. They would see a woman who had been abandoned, who had waited too long, who had only come home because she had finally given up. They would be wrong. But Clara wasn't sure she had the words to make them understand. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and crossed the street. The door opened before she could knock. Her mother stood in the doorway, older than Clara remembered, her hair more gray than brown now, her face lined in ways it hadn't been before. But her eyes were the same, sharp and knowing, taking in Clara's travel-worn clothes and wind-burned cheeks with a single glance. "Clara," her mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "You came." "I came." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her mother stepped forward and pulled Clara into an embrace that was fierce and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't said in 5 years of careful, distant letters. "My girl," her mother sobbed against Clara's hair. "My stubborn, foolish, brave girl, you came home." Clara held her mother tight, feeling the familiar shape of her, the lavender scent she had worn as long as Clara could remember. Tears were streaming down her own face now, hot against her cold cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." "Hush." Her mother pulled back, wiping Clara's tears with hands that trembled. "None of that now. You're here. That's all that matters." She led Clara inside into the warmth and light of the house where Clara had grown up. Everything was the same, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the portrait of her grandmother over the fireplace, the worn carpet on the stairs that she had slid down as a child. Yet it all seemed to belong to another lifetime, another version of Clara who had existed before Wyoming, before Thomas, before Luke. Her father was waiting in the parlor. He looked older too, and thinner than she remembered. The illness her mother had mentioned was visible in the pallor of his skin, the way he leaned heavily on the arm of his chair, but his eyes were clear and sharp, fixed on Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Father," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Clara." He nodded slowly, his gaze taking her in. "You look well. Different, but well. The West changes people." "So I've heard." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. We have much to discuss." Clara sat, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Her mother settled beside her father, reaching out to take his hand in a gesture of unity that made Clara's heart ache. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 5 years of unspoken words. "Your mother tells me you've been teaching," her father said finally. Clara nodded. "At the school in Copper Creek. It's a small town, but the children are eager to learn." "And the man? The soldier you followed west?" Clara had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer 100 times on the long journey east, but now that the moment was here, all her careful words seemed inadequate. "Thomas is dead," she said simply. "He died 3 years ago, in a mining accident in Colorado. I only learned of it this past summer." Her mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Clara, we didn't know." "No one knew. No one thought to tell me. Clara kept her voice steady. I spent 5 years waiting for a man who was already in his grave. 5 years hoping and believing and refusing to give up. Her father's expression shifted, something softening around his eyes. That must have been difficult, learning the truth. It was. Clara paused, searching for the right words. But it was also a relief. The not knowing was the hardest part. Once I knew for certain, I could finally let him go. The room fell silent again. Clara could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting off seconds that felt like hours. I owe you an apology, her father said finally. Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. Her father never apologized. He was a man who believed in being right, in standing firm, in never admitting weakness. But he continued, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. When you left, I said things I shouldn't have. I called you foolish. I said you would come crawling back when your soldier abandoned you. I was angry, and I was scared, and I took it out on you instead of trusting you to make your own choices. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Father, let me finish. He held up a hand. I spent 5 years telling myself I was right, that you would see the error of your ways and come home. But you didn't come home. You stayed. You built a life. And somewhere along the way, I realized that maybe you weren't the foolish one. Maybe I was. Clara didn't know what to say. This was so different from what she had expected, so different from the confrontation she had braced herself for. I'm not the same person who left 5 years ago, she said slowly. I've changed, I've grown, and I'm not sorry for going west, even with everything that happened. It made me who I am. Her father nodded, a small smile touching his lips. I can see that. You carry yourself differently now, like a woman who knows her own mind. I do know my own mind. Clara straightened in her chair. And there's something else you should know. I've met someone. Someone good, someone honest. His name is Luke Hart, and he's a foreman at a ranch near Copper Creek. Her mother's eyes widened. You're courting again? More than courting. Clara touched the ring on her finger, Luke's mother's ring, the promise he had made. He wants to marry me, and I want to marry him. The words hung in the air, bright and defiant. Clara watched her parents' faces, waiting for the objections, the warnings, the reminders of how badly things had gone the last time she had followed her heart. But instead, her father simply asked, Do you love him? Clara met his eyes. Yes, more than I ever loved Thomas, more than I knew I could love anyone. Her father studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Then that's what matters. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Her father's approval shouldn't have meant so much. She was a grown woman, capable of making her own choices. But it did. It mattered more than she could say. Tell us about him, her mother said softly. This Luke of yours. And Clara did. The days that followed were strange and wonderful, a time of reconciliation that Clara had never dared to hope for. She told her parents everything, about Luke, about Noah, about the Miller family and the schoolhouse and the life she had built in Wyoming. She told them about the fence post, about the years of waiting, about the letter that had finally set her free. And she listened as they told her about the years she had missed, her father's illness, which had started as a cough and grown into something more serious, her mother's loneliness, rattling around the big house with no children to fill it, the slow, painful process of accepting that their only daughter was gone, perhaps forever. We should have written more, her mother admitted one evening as they sat by the fire drinking tea. We should have tried harder to bridge the distance. Clara shook her head. I could have written more too. I was so focused on Thomas, on waiting, that I forgot about everything else, everyone else. We all made mistakes, her father said quietly. The question is what we do now. What they did was talk. Hour after hour, day after day, they talked, filling in the gaps, healing the wounds, rebuilding the connection that had been so badly damaged. Clara learned that her father had kept every letter she had ever sent, even the short, perfunctory ones she had written out of obligation rather than love. Her mother had saved the newspaper clippings about Wyoming, had followed the news from the West as if searching for any mention of her daughter. They had missed her. desperately, achingly missed her, even if they had been too proud to say so. And Clara had missed them too, she realized. She had been so determined to move forward, to build a new life, that she had tried to forget the old one. But family wasn't something you could forget, no matter how far you ran. Christmas came, and with it a warmth that Clara had forgotten existed in this cold, formal house. Her mother decorated the parlor with evergreen boughs, and her father insisted on reading from the family Bible the way he had when Clara was a child. They exchanged small gifts. Clara had brought trinkets from Wyoming, leather goods and beaded work that seemed exotic in this Boston setting. And for a few hours, it was as if the past 5 years had never happened. But they had happened. And Clara couldn't forget the life that was waiting for her out west, the man who was waiting, the future she had chosen. She told her parents she was leaving on the third day after Christmas. Her mother cried, but not with the desperate grief of 5 years ago. These were gentler tears, the tears of a woman who understood that letting go was sometimes the greatest act of love. "You'll write more often?" her mother asked, clutching Clara's hands. "Every week," Clara promised. "And you must write back. I want to know everything, Father's health, the neighborhood gossip, what you're reading and thinking, everything." "We will." Her mother pulled her into a fierce embrace. "And perhaps, when you're settled, perhaps we could visit? See this Wyoming of yours?" Clara felt her heart swell. "I would love that. I would love to show you my home." My home. The words felt right in a way they never had before. Wyoming was her home. Luke and Noah and the Millers and the schoolhouse and even that weathered fence post, they were her home, and she was ready to go back to them. Her father walked her to the door when the carriage came to take her to the station. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but he insisted on seeing her off properly. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice gruff. "I know I never said it before. I should have, but I'm saying it now. You've become a remarkable woman, Clara, stronger than I ever expected." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Thank you, Father. That means more than you know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This was your grandmother's. She left it to me to give to you when you were ready. I think you're ready now." Clara opened the pouch and found a gold locket on a delicate chain. Inside was a miniature portrait of her grandmother as a young woman, her eyes bright with the same spirit that Clara saw in her own mirror. "She was a pioneer too, in her way," her father said. "Came to this country from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to make something of herself. She would have understood you, Clara, better than I ever did." Clara clasped the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart, a connection to the past, a blessing for the future. "Thank you," she whispered. Her father pulled her into an embrace, the first real hug he had given her since she was a child. Clara held on tight, breathing in the familiar scent of tobacco and wool, committing the moment to memory. "Go," he said finally, releasing her. "Go back to your life, your man, your future, and know that wherever you are, you carry our love with you." Clara climbed into the carriage, her heart full to bursting. As the horses pulled away, she looked back at the brownstone where she had grown up, at her father standing in the doorway with one hand raised in farewell. She was leaving Boston again, but this time she wasn't running away from something. She was running toward something, and that made all the difference. The journey west felt shorter than the journey east, though it took the same number of days. Clara spent the long hours staring out the stagecoach window, watching the landscape transform from the cramped cities of the east to the wide-open spaces she had come to love. Each mile that passed brought her closer to Luke, closer to home, closer to the life she had chosen. She touched the ring on her finger often, reassuring herself that it was real. Luke's promise, his mother's ring, the future he had offered her with no conditions, no expectations, no pressure. She was ready for that future now, ready in a way she hadn't been before. The coach reached Copper Creek on a January afternoon, the sun bright and cold in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Snow still lay thick on the ground, but the roads were clear and the town was bustling with the activity of people who had been cooped up too long by winter storms. Clara stepped out of the coach and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp Wyoming air. Home. She was home. She had sent a letter ahead, letting Luke know when to expect her, but she hadn't been sure it would arrive in time. So she wasn't expecting anyone to meet her, wasn't expecting to see a familiar figure standing at the edge of the platform, his hat pulled low against the sun, his eyes fixed on the coach with an intensity that made her heart race. Luke. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Clara was running, her skirts gathered in her hands, her bag forgotten on the platform behind her. She threw herself into his arms, and he caught her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed and cried and said his name over and over. "You came back," Luke said, setting her down but not letting go. "You really came back." "I promised I would." Clara pulled back enough to look at his face, memorizing every line and angle. "I always keep my promises." Luke kissed her then, right there on the platform in front of everyone. A kiss that was fierce and tender and full of all the weeks they had spent apart. Clara heard someone whistle, probably one of the ranch hands, but she didn't care. Let them watch. Let the whole town watch. She was home, and she was loved, and nothing else mattered. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of reunion and celebration. Noah nearly knocked Clara over when he saw her, hugging her so tight she could barely breathe and talking a mile a minute about everything she had missed. Elizabeth cried happy tears and fed her until she couldn't eat another bite. Even Samuel, normally so reserved, clapped her on the shoulder and said it was good to have her back. And Luke was everywhere. He came to town every day, sometimes twice a day, finding excuses to see her that made Clara laugh and Mrs. Henderson roll her eyes knowingly. He brought her flowers that he'd somehow found growing in a sheltered spot, and books he'd ordered special from Denver, and once a perfect snowflake pressed between two pieces of glass. "I found it the morning after you left," he told her. "It was so beautiful. I wanted to keep it for you. Wanted to give you something that reminded you of home." Clara held the glass up to the light, watching the intricate pattern of the snowflake. It was beautiful, delicate and complex and utterly unique. "I love it," she said. "I love everything about this place. I love you." Luke's eyes softened. "I love you too. More than I ever thought I could love anyone." They were sitting on the porch of the schoolhouse, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to exist only in Wyoming. "I want to ask you something," Luke said, his voice low and serious. Clara's heart skipped. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, different from the turquoise promise ring. This one was gold, set with a small diamond that caught the dying light. "Clara Whitfield," Luke said, "I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing at that fence post, waiting for a man who couldn't come back to you. I have loved you through your grief and your healing and your transformation into the woman you were always meant to be. I have loved you across the distance of winter storms and the miles between my ranch and your room above the general store." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted to feel this moment, every part of it, wanted to remember it forever. "I don't have much to offer you," Luke continued. "A foreman's wages, a small cabin on the Peterson ranch, a life of hard work and uncertain futures. But I offer you all of it, everything I have, everything I am, if you'll have me." He looked up at her, his eyes bright with hope and fear and love. "Clara Whitfield, will you marry me?" The word came without hesitation, rising from somewhere deep in Clara's soul. "Yes." Luke's face transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunlight through clouds. He slipped the ring onto her finger next to the turquoise promise ring, and then he was kissing her again, and Clara was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said again between kisses. "Yes, yes, yes." The wedding was held in April when the snow had melted and the first wildflowers were beginning to push through the thawing ground. The whole town turned out, packing into the small church until people were standing in the aisles and spilling out the doors. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that Elizabeth had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to Luke's mother. Her grandmother's locket hung at her throat, and her mother's wedding veil, sent from Boston along with her parents' blessing, covered her hair. Noah stood at the front of the church, proud and solemn in his new suit, holding the rings on a velvet cushion. He had been practicing for weeks, terrified of dropping them, and Clara had to bite back a smile at the fierce concentration on his face. Luke was waiting at the altar, and when Clara began her walk down the aisle, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. He looked handsome in his dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his weathered face clean-shaven for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. But it was his expression that made Clara's heart overflow. The look of a man who couldn't quite believe his luck, who was watching his dreams come true in real time. The ceremony was simple and brief, the words spoken with sincerity rather than pomp. When the minister asked if Luke took Clara to be his wife, his voice was steady and sure. When he asked Clara the same question, she answered with the whole of her heart, "I do." Luke lifted her veil and kissed her, and the church erupted in cheers. Noah bounced on his toes, grinning ear to ear. Elizabeth sobbed into Samuel's shoulder. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and declared it the most beautiful wedding Copper Creek had ever seen. And Clara, standing in her husband's arms, felt the last of her old self slip away. She was no longer Clara Whitfield, the woman who waited by the fence. She was Clara Hart, wife and teacher and friend, a woman who had learned that sometimes the best things in life were worth waiting for, and sometimes they showed up when you least expected them. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under a canopy of spring stars. Clara danced with Luke, with Noah, with Samuel, and half the men in town. She laughed until her cheeks hurt, and ate until she couldn't take another bite, and hugged so many well-wishers that her arms ached. But eventually, the party wound down, and Clara and Luke slipped away to begin their new life together. The cabin on the Peterson ranch was small but well-built, with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Luke had been working on it for months, adding touches that he thought Clara would like. A bookshelf by the fireplace, a writing desk under the window, curtains in the blue fabric she had once admired at the general store. And in the yard, next to the path that led to the main house, he had installed a fence post. Clara saw it when they arrived, and she stopped short, her hand flying to her mouth. "Luke, what is this?" He came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. "I thought about it a lot while you were gone, about what that fence post meant to you, about the woman who stood there for 5 years, waiting and hoping and refusing to give up." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Luke, that woman had more strength than anyone I've ever known," he continued. "More faith, more courage, more heart. I fell in love with her before I even knew her name." He turned her to face him. "I wanted to give you a new fence post. Not a place to wait, but a place to remember. A reminder of how far you've come." Clara looked at the post, then back at Luke. The old grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it was quieter now, gentler. A scar rather than a wound. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." Luke kissed her forehead. "You're welcome. Now come inside. I want to show you our home." Our home. The words wrapped around Clara like a warm blanket. She followed Luke through the door, into the firelight and the warmth, and felt the last of her walls crumble away. She was home. Finally, truly, completely home. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse, her students thriving under her care. She visited the Miller farm every Sunday, watching Noah grow taller and stronger and more confident with each passing week. And she came home every evening to Luke, to their small cabin on the hill, to the life they were building together one day at a time. Summer came, and with it a letter from Boston. Clara's parents were coming to visit. Clara threw herself into preparations, cleaning the cabin from top to bottom, planning meals and activities, worrying over every detail. Luke watched her frenzy with amusement, occasionally pulling her away from her task to remind her that her parents were coming to see her, not to inspect her housekeeping. "They won't care if there's dust on the mantel," he said. "They just want to see their daughter happy." "I know," Clara sighed. "I just want everything to be perfect." "It will be," Luke assured her, "because you'll be there. That's all they need." Her parents arrived on a July afternoon, stepping off the stagecoach looking travel-worn but excited. Her mother exclaimed over the mountains and the wildflowers and the impossibly blue sky. Her father leaned on his cane and surveyed the landscape with the eye of a man who had spent his life in cities and wasn't sure what to make of all this open space. But when they saw Clara running toward them, their faces transformed with joy. The visit was everything Clara had hoped for. She showed her parents the schoolhouse and the general store and the church where she had been married. She introduced them to Elizabeth and Samuel and Noah, who charmed them immediately with his earnest manner and quick smile. She took them to see the ranch, where Luke demonstrated his horsemanship, and her father nodded with grudging approval. And she showed them the fence post. They stood before it on their last evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Clara told them everything, about Thomas, about the waiting, about the letter that had finally set her free. She told them about Luke, about the ring he had given her, about the love that had grown from grief and blossomed into something beautiful. Her mother wept. Her father was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the weathered wood. "You waited 5 years," he said finally. 5 years for a man you never saw again." Clara nodded. "I did." "That's extraordinary." He turned to look at her, and she saw something new in his eyes. Not just love, but respect. "I don't think I could have done it. I don't think most people could have done it." "I'm not sure I could do it again," Clara admitted. "But I don't regret it. That waiting taught me who I am. It taught me what I'm capable of, and it led me here." She gestured at the cabin, at the mountains, at Luke walking toward them from the barn, with Noah running ahead. "It led me home." Her father nodded slowly. "Then it was worth it." Clara smiled. "Yes, it was." Her parents left the next morning, with promises to return the following summer and invitations for Clara and Luke to visit Boston. Clara hugged them both fiercely, no longer feeling the old tension, the old resentment. They had made their peace with each other. They were family again. As the stagecoach disappeared down the road, Luke came to stand beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Good visit?" "The best." Clara leaned into him. "I didn't think it was possible, to fix what was broken between us. But it happened." "Sometimes broken things can be mended," Luke said. "Sometimes they end up stronger than before." Clara looked up at him, at the face she loved more than any other in the world. "Like us?" "Like us." He kissed her softly. "Come on. Noah's been asking when we're going to go fishing, and I promised him today was the day." Clara laughed. "Then we'd better not keep him waiting." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the Wyoming sun warm on their faces, the future stretching before them like an open road. And Clara thought about all the things she had learned in the past year, about love and loss, about waiting and letting go, about the courage it took to start again. She had come to Wyoming chasing a dream, and she had found something better than any dream could ever be. She had found a family, a purpose, a home. She had found Luke and Noah and the Millers. She had found herself. And she had learned that sometimes the best things in life weren't the things you waited for, but the things that showed up unexpectedly, catching you off guard and changing everything you thought you knew. Clara touched the fence post one last time as she passed it, feeling the warm wood beneath her fingers. It stood there in the Wyoming sun, no longer a marker of absence, but a monument to resilience, a reminder of the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Not a woman abandoned by silence, but a woman who had survived it. Not a woman waiting for life to begin, but a woman living it fully, every precious day. The future stretched before her, bright with possibility. And Clara Hart walked into it with her head held high and her heart wide open, finally ready for whatever came next. Because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that love wasn't about waiting for someone to come back to you. It was about having the courage to move forward, even when you couldn't see where the road was leading. It was about opening your heart, even after it had been broken. It was about choosing hope again and again, until hope became faith, and faith became reality. And in the end, that was exactly what Clara had done. She had stopped waiting. She had started living. And she had found everything she never knew she was looking for. The Wyoming wind blew soft and warm, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. In the distance, Noah's laughter rang out clear and bright. Luke squeezed Clara's hand, and she squeezed back. And together, they walked toward home.